Section 1 Introduction. In this study, we delve into the inner workings of large language models, LLMs, specifically focusing on how they evolve as they scale up. As these models become more powerful and versatile, they can be integrated into a variety of applications and decision-making processes. However, this scaling up also makes it more challenging for researchers to interpret these models, as they require significant computational resources. We've analyzed a group of opt models with up to 66 billion parameters, keeping our analysis lightweight enough to be conducted using a single graphics processing unit, GPU. Our focus is on the neurons inside the feed-forward networks, FFNs, of these models, which are the individual activations between the two linear layers of the transformer FFNs. Unlike neurons in the residual stream, FFN neurons are more likely to represent meaningful features. This is because the element-wise nonlinearity in these neurons breaks the rotational invariance of the representation, encouraging features to align with the basis dimensions. When a neuron is activated, it updates the residual stream by pulling out the corresponding row of the second FFN layer. If it's not activated, it doesn't update the residual stream. We found that in the first half of the network, many neurons never activate on a large collection of diverse data, meaning they are dead. Larger models have more of these dead neurons. For instance, in the 66 billion parameter model, over 70% of the neurons in some layers are dead. However, many of the active neurons in the early part of the network are reserved for discrete features and act as indicator functions for tokens and n-grams. These neurons activate only if the input is a certain token or an n-gram. Interestingly, these neurons not only promote concepts related to the potential next token candidate, but they also explicitly remove information about the current input. We also discovered that some neurons encode positional information regardless of textual patterns. Many of these neurons act as indicator functions of position ranges, activating for positions within certain ranges and not activating otherwise. These neurons often work together to efficiently cover all possible positions. In summary, we found neurons that are dead act as token and n-gram detectors, and encode position regardless of textual content. As models scale up, they have more dead neurons and token detectors and are less focused on absolute position. For our study, we used opt models, which are publicly available pre-trained transformers. We also used data from diverse sources, including subsets of the validation and test part of the pile, Reddit, and code data from CodeParrot. For the experiments on dead neurons, we used even more data, including additional data from Wikipedia, DM Mathematics, and CodeParrot, as well as new domains from the pile. Section Summary. In this section, the authors discuss the analysis of large language models, LLMs, and focus on the neurons inside the transformer feedforward blocks, FFNs. They find that many neurons in the early part of the network are dead and never activate, while the alive neurons in this region act as indicator functions for tokens and n-grams. Additionally, they discover neurons that encode positional information regardless of textual patterns, challenging the key-value memory view of FFN layers. Overall, they argue that the roles played by these layers are still poorly understood. Section. Single GPU processing. In our research, we used a single graphics processing unit, GPU, to process sets of neuron values for some data. This means we only ran forward passes of the full model or its first few layers. Because large models don't fit into a single GPU, we loaded one layer at a time, keeping the rest of the layers on the central processing unit, CPU. This method allowed us to record neuron activations for large models. All the main experiments in this paper were conducted on a single GPU. We started by examining simple statistics like neuron activation frequency. We found that many neurons never activate on our diverse data, meaning they can be seen as dead. In fact, the proportion of dead neurons is quite high. For instance, in the 66 billion parameter model, the proportion of dead neurons in some layers is above 70%. We also observed that larger models are more sparse because they have more dead neurons and the ones that are alive activate less frequently. Interestingly, this kind of sparsity is specific only to early layers. This leads to a clear distinction between the first and the second halves of the network. While the first half contains a solid proportion of dead neurons, the second half is fully alive. Moreover, layers with most dead neurons are the ones where alive neurons activate most rarely. This difference in sparsity across layers might be explained by the concept-to-neuron ratio being much smaller in the early layers than in the higher layers. In the early layers, encoded concepts are largely shallow and are likely to be discrete, while at the higher layers, networks learn high-level semantics and reasoning. The more neurons are available to the model, the easier it is to assign dedicated neurons to some features. However, the space of fine-grained semantic concepts is too large compared to the number of available neurons, which makes it hard to reserve many dedicated neuron concept pairs. There can, however, be a few specialized neurons in the higher layers. For example, BERT has neurons responsible for relational facts. We also considered whether dead neurons are completely dead or if they correspond to patterns so rare that we never encountered them in our large diverse collection of data. While the latter is possible, it further supports the hypothesis of models assigning dedicated neurons to specific concepts. Next, we analyzed how neuron activations depend on an input n-gram. For each input text with tokens, we recorded neuron activations at each position, and if a neuron is activated at position k, we say that the n-gram triggered this neuron. We then looked at how many n-grams are able to trigger each neuron. For each neuron, we evaluated the number of n-grams that cover at least 95% of the neuron's activations. As anticipated, neurons in larger models are covered by fewer n-grams. Also, the largest models have a substantial proportion of neurons that are covered by as few as 1 to 5 tokens. We also found neurons that can be triggered by only a few tokens, pointing to the possibility that some neurons act as token detectors. They activate if and only if the input is one of the corresponding tokens, regardless of the previous context. We found that there are indeed a lot of token-detecting neurons. As expected, larger models have more such neurons, and the 66 billion parameter model has overall 5,351 token detectors. Interestingly, the behavior of the largest models differs from that of the rest. While for smaller models the number of token detectors increases then goes down, larger models operate in 3 monotonic stages and start having many token-detecting neurons from the very first layer. This already shows qualitative differences between the models. With more capacity, larger models perform more complicated reasoning with more distinct stages. Section Summary. In this section, the authors discuss their approach to processing large models on a single GPU by loading one layer at a time. They observe that many neurons in the early layers of the model are dead and do not activate, while the second half of the network is fully alive. They hypothesize that the sparsity in the early layers is due to the smaller ratio of concepts to neurons, allowing the model to assign dedicated neurons to specific features. Additionally, they find that some neurons act as token detectors, activating only for specific tokens regardless of the previous context. Section 4.3 Ensemble-Like Behavior of the Layers. Let's delve into the intriguing behavior of the layers in our model. We'll start by examining tokens that have been identified by specific neurons. When we look at the number of these detected tokens in each layer, and cumulatively across all layers, we notice something interesting. For instance, in the 66B model, each layer focuses on no more than 1,500 tokens, but in total, over 10,000 tokens are detected. This suggests that different layers are responsible for detecting different tokens. In fact, as we move up the layers, the tokens detected in each layer are mostly different from those detected in the layers below. This suggests that the layers are working together, each focusing on different tokens, much like an ensemble. This strategy of dividing and conquering allows larger models to cover many tokens and use their capacity more effectively. This ensemble-like behavior has been observed in deep residual networks in computer vision models. For transformers, previous experiments have shown that performance isn't significantly affected by dropping or reordering layers. Now, let's try to understand the role of these token-detecting neurons. As we move through the layers, the token representation in the residual stream is transformed from the token embedding for the current input token to a representation that encodes a distribution for the next token. This transformation is achieved through additive updates from attention and FFN blocks in each layer. When an FFN neuron is activated, the corresponding row of the second FFN layer, multiplied by the value of this neuron, is added to the residual stream. By projecting this FFN row onto the vocabulary, we can interpret this update in terms of its influence on the output distribution encoded in the residual stream. Previously, this influence was understood only in terms of the top projections, i.e., tokens that are promoted. This reflects the view that the current token identity is gradually lost over the course of layers. However, we also look at the bottom projections. If these projections are negative, the corresponding tokens are suppressed by the model. Interestingly, we find that token-detecting neurons often deliberately suppress the tokens they detect. While the top promoted concepts are potential next token candidates, the top suppressed concepts are the tokens triggering this neuron. This means that the vector updates corresponding to these neurons point in the direction of the next token candidates and away from the tokens triggering the neuron. This is not trivial since these updates play two very different roles at the same time. In fact, for over 80% of token-detecting neurons, their corresponding updates point in the negative direction from the triggering tokens. We argue that models can have mechanisms that are targeted at removing information from the residual stream, which is an area that can be explored further in future work. In the appendix, we show results for bigrams and trigrams that mirror our observations for unigrams. Larger models have more specialized neurons, and in each layer, models cover mostly new n-grams. Interestingly, for larger n-grams, there is a more drastic gap between larger and smaller models. When analyzing dead neurons, we also noticed some neurons that only activate for a few first token positions. This led us to investigate how position is encoded in the model and whether some neurons are responsible for encoding positional information. To identify these positional neurons, we look for neurons whose activation patterns are strongly dependent on token position. We calculate the mutual information between two random variables, whether the neuron is activated or not, and the token position. We gather neuron activations for full-length data for Wikipedia, DM Mathematics, and CodeParrot. We then calculate the mutual information using the activation frequency of the neuron at each position and the total activation frequency of the neuron. Section summary. The layers in the model exhibit ensemble-like behavior, where token-detecting neurons are responsible for different tokens across layers, allowing larger models to effectively cover a larger number of tokens. Token-detecting neurons in the model deliberately suppress the tokens they detect, pointing away from the triggering tokens and towards potential next token candidates. Additionally, larger models have more specialized neurons and cover mostly new n-grams in each layer. Some neurons in the model encode positional information and their activation patterns strongly depend on token position. Section: Choosing the neurons. In this section, we'll discuss how we select and categorize neurons based on their activation patterns, and how these patterns change across different models. Firstly, we choose neurons that have a high mutual information with position, meaning their activation frequency is dependent on position rather than content. This allows us to identify neurons that are activated within a certain position range, regardless of the data domain. We can then consider these neurons as being responsible for position, at least to some extent. After identifying these positional neurons, we classify them based on their activation patterns. We've identified four main types. 1. Oscillatory neurons. These neurons have an activation pattern that is an indicator function of position ranges. In simpler terms, these neurons are activated if and only if the position falls within a certain set. This activation pattern is not influenced by the data domain, meaning it is determined solely by position and not by any lexical or semantic information. 2. Neurons with both types of activation extremes. These neurons have an activation pattern that is not oscillatory, but still has intervals where the activation frequency reaches both extremes. 0, never activated, and 1, always activated. Typically, these neurons are activated only for positions less than or greater than a certain value and are not activated otherwise. 3. Neurons with only one type of activation extremes. Unlike the previous two types, these neurons can only reach one of the extreme values 0 or 1. While they never behave as indicator functions, there are position ranges where a neuron being activated or not depends solely on token position. 4. Other neurons. These neurons have activation patterns that strongly depend on position but do not have intervals where activation frequency stays at 0 or 1. Typically, these activation patterns have lower mutual information with position than the previous three types. We also distinguish between strong and weak versions of each type. For the first three types, the difference between strong and weak patterns lies in whether the activation frequency equals 0 or 1, or is close to, but not equal to, 0 or 1. For the last type, the difference lies in how well we can predict activation frequency on a certain position, knowing this value for the neighboring positions. Next, we examine how these positional neurons behave across different models. We find that smaller models rely heavily on oscillatory neurons, which allows them to accurately determine a token's absolute position. Larger models, on the other hand, do not have oscillatory neurons and rely on more generic patterns. Interestingly, as the model size increases, the model tends to abstract away from absolute position, suggesting that larger models rely on something more meaningful than absolute position. We also observe that positional neurons seem to work together to cover the full set of positions. For example, in the second layer of a smaller model, 10 strongly oscillatory neurons efficiently cover all positions such that none of these neurons is redundant. Finally, we notice two stages of positional information within the model, the first third of the model and the rest. The first third of the model corresponds to the sparse stage with the dead neurons and n-gram detectors. We hypothesize that in these two stages, positional information is first used locally to detect shallow patterns, and then more globally to use longer contexts and help encode semantic information. This aligns with previous findings that positional information should, and does, get lost as we move through the layers of the model. Section Summary. In this section, the authors discuss the selection and categorization of neurons based on their activation patterns and mutual information with position. They identify three types of positional neurons: oscillatory neurons, both types of activation extremes, and neurons with only one type of activation extreme. They also observe that smaller models rely more on oscillatory neurons, while larger models use more generic patterns. Additionally, they find that positional neurons work together to cover the full set of positions and that there are two stages of positional information within the model, with preferences for different patterns changing between the stages. Section 5.4 Positional neurons are learned even without positional encoding. We've discovered that autoregressive language models can learn positional information even without explicit positional encoding. We believe that these models, which we'll refer to as no-pos models, use what we call positional neurons to encode position. To test this, we trained two versions of a model with 125 million parameters, one with positional encodings and one without, and compared their positional neurons. We used a smaller training dataset from the Open Web Text Corpus, which is a freely available version of the GPT-2 training data. This dataset contains 3 billion tokens, compared to the 180 billion tokens used for the original model. Our findings showed that the model without positional encoding also exhibited strong positional patterns. However, it lacked oscillatory neurons, which, when combined with other positional neurons, allow for more accurate encoding of absolute position. This suggests that the no-pos model relies on more generic patterns, such as neurons that encode whether a position is greater or less than a certain value. We also found that oscillatory patterns only emerge with extended training. We trained the baseline model with 125 million parameters for 50,000, 150,000, and 300,000 training batches. All models exhibited strong positional patterns, but only the last one developed oscillatory neurons. This indicates that learning absolute position requires more training time. There's a common belief that the feed-forward layers in transformer-based language models function as key-value memories, with each key correlating with textual patterns in the training examples, and each value inducing a distribution over the output vocabulary. While we found this to be true for some neurons, our results also showed that feed-forward layers can be used in ways that don't align with the key-value memory perspective. For instance, the activations of strong positional neurons are determined by position, regardless of textual content, and the corresponding values don't seem to encode meaningful distributions over vocabulary. This suggests that these neurons serve a different function than matching textual patterns to sets of the next token candidates. It also implies that we still have much to learn about the roles played by transformer feed-forward layers. Interestingly, the model with 350 million parameters doesn't follow the same pattern as the other models. It doesn't have dead neurons, and its neuron activations don't appear to be sparse with respect to triggering them n-grams, as we observed in the other models. However, it does have positional neurons. This discrepancy becomes less surprising when we consider that the 350 million parameter model is implemented differently from the rest. It applies layer norm after attention and feed-forward blocks, while all the other models apply it before. These seemingly minor implementation details can significantly affect the interpretability of model components. Previous work has also attempted to choose certain modeling aspects to enhance interpretability, such as selecting an activation function to increase the number of interpretable neurons, or developing sparse softmax variants to make output distributions or attention more interpretable. Historically, neurons have been a fundamental unit of analysis. Early work focused on convolutional networks for images and later for convolutional text classifiers. Similar to our work, these studies also found n-gram detectors. However, this is a relatively trivial observation for small convolutional text classifiers compared to large transformer-based language models like ours. For recurrent networks, interpretable neurons include simple patterns such as line lengths, brackets and quotes, sentiment neurons, and various neurons in machine translation models. For transformer-based BERT, some neurons inside feed-forward blocks are responsible for storing factual knowledge. Larger units of analysis include attention blocks, feed-forward layers, and circuits responsible for certain tasks.